February 1945. The freezing wind cut through the thin wooden walls of the camp barracks like a knife. Eastern Europe was falling apart. The Soviet Red Army pushed closer every single day. Their tanks rumbled in the distance. Their artillery shook the ground at night. Nazi Germany was dying, and everyone could feel it. The railway lines that once brought supplies had been bombed into twisted metal. Bridges were gone. Roads were cratered. Nothing moved smoothly anymore. Food that used to arrive every week now came every month, or not at all. Inside a small sub-camp connected to Ravensbrück, over 2,000 women were crammed into buildings meant for only 400 people. These were not ordinary prisoners, they were Allied soldiers. Some were nurses captured when field hospitals were overrun. Others were resistance fighters caught sabotaging German supply lines. A few were air crews shot down over occupied territory. They wore the same ragged striped uniforms as other camp prisoners, but they knew they were military. They knew the Geneva Convention was supposed to protect them. But in February 1945, as Germany collapsed, those rules meant nothing. Each morning, the women received the same ration. 200 grams of bread. That was about 7 ounces, roughly the size of a deck of cards. The bread was dark, dense, and mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. It tasted like dirt. For lunch, they got watery soup made from potato peels and whatever rotting vegetables the guards could find. Maybe 300 calories total. Maybe a grown woman needs at least 1,500 calories just to survive without working. These women were forced to do hard labor. They carried rocks. They dug trenches. They sorted salvaged metal from bombed buildings. On 300 calories a day, their bodies ate themselves. Their muscles disappeared. Their cheekbones pressed against paper-thin skin. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls, but for the past 5 days, even that miserable ration had stopped coming. The supply truck never arrived. The kitchen had run out of everything. The guards shrugged and said there was nothing they could do. Some whispered that the camp was going to be evacuated. Others said they heard orders to eliminate prisoners before the Soviets arrived. Nobody knew what was true. The women just knew they were starving. Real starvation, not just hunger. The kind where your body shuts down. Where standing up makes you dizzy, where your thoughts move like cold honey. On the morning of the 6th day, an older Wehrmacht guard walked through the barracks for roll call. His name was Friedrich Weber. He was not SS. That mattered. The SS were the true believers, the ones who ran the camps with ideological fury. The Wehrmacht were regular army. Many were just conscripts, men drafted into service who had no choice. Weber was 53 years old. Too old for frontline combat. He had been a schoolteacher in Bavaria before the war. He taught literature and history. He had a wife and 2 daughters back home. The daughters were 19 and 21, about the same age as many of the women standing in front of him now. Weber walked down the line of prisoners. His breath came out in white clouds. The temperature was below freezing. The women wore summer-weight dresses and had no coats. He stopped in front of a group of 8 British and French nurses. They swayed on their feet. One woman, a British nurse named Margaret Hale, could barely keep her eyes open. She had been captured in France in 1944 when her hospital was overrun during the German counteroffensive. She was 24 years old. Back home in Manchester, her mother still set a place for her at dinner every Sunday. Weber looked at Margaret. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her hands shook. She weighed maybe 80 pounds. He had seen this before on the Eastern Front. He had watched soldiers starve in the retreat from Stalingrad. He knew what 5 days without food did to a person. He knew what another 2 days would do. He made a decision that would cost him his life. "You're coming with me," Weber said in rough English. His voice was quiet but firm. Margaret looked up. Fear shot through her body like electricity. The other nurses stiffened. Everyone in the camp knew what those words usually meant. Prisoners were taken away for interrogation, for punishment, for execution. The SS had taken groups away just last week. Nobody saw them again. Gunshots echoed from the woods beyond the fence. Weber saw the terror in their eyes. "Now," he said, "all of you, follow me." Margaret's legs almost gave out. A French nurse named Elise grabbed her arm to steady her. They exchanged glances. This was it. After surviving 18 months in the camp, after enduring disease and beatings and watching friends die, this was how it ended. Shot in the woods. Buried in unmarked graves. Weber turned and walked toward the back of the camp. The 8 women followed. Their wooden clogs scraped against the frozen mud. Other prisoners watched silently. Nobody said goodbye. Saying goodbye made it real. The women passed the main gate. They passed the guard towers. They walked toward a small building that had once housed the camp commandant. The commandant had fled 3 days ago when the Soviet artillery got close enough to hear clearly. He took his staff car and his personal belongings and disappeared west. The building stood empty. Weber stopped at a side door. He looked around carefully. 2 other Wehrmacht guards stood nearby, both older men like himself. They nodded at him. Weber pulled out a key and unlocked the door. He pushed it open and gestured for the women to enter. Margaret went first. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She stepped into darkness. Her eyes adjusted. They were in the old commandant's kitchen storage room. And there, stacked against the wall, were things the women had not seen in over a year. Real food. Margaret stared at the pile of food like it was a dream. 15 kilograms of potatoes sat in burlap sacks against the wall. That was over 30 pounds. Real potatoes, not rotten ones or peels. Next to them were 6 tins of meat. The labels showed pork and beef. There were 2 blocks of butter wrapped in waxed paper. Each block was at least half a kilogram. Real butter, yellow and solid. A jar of preserved fruit sat on a shelf. Margaret had not seen preserved fruit since before her capture. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch a potato. It felt solid and real under her fingers. Weber moved quickly. He grabbed a pot from a hook and filled it with water from a bucket. He dumped 10 potatoes into the pot. He did not peel them. There was no time for that. He set the pot on a small stove and lit a fire underneath. The wood crackled, the smell of smoke filled the room. Then he opened one of the tins of meat with a knife. The sound of metal scraping metal made the women flinch. Inside was actual pork in thick gravy. Weber dumped it into a second pot. He set that on the stove too. "Sit," he said in English. "You eat soon." The women did not move. They stood frozen, waiting for the trap to spring. Elise, the French nurse, spoke up in broken German. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Weber kept stirring the pots. He did not look at them. "I have daughters," he said simply. "Your age. They write letters. They tell me about the war." He paused. His jaw tightened. "They tell me American bombs hit our city, but they also tell me something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn from being read many times. He handed it to Margaret. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter written in German. Margaret could read some German from her school days. The handwriting was neat and young. It was from Weber's younger daughter, Anna. The letter was dated January 1945, just 1 month ago. Margaret's eyes scanned the words. Anna wrote about food shortages at home, about standing in line for hours to get bread, about how their rations had been cut again. But then Anna wrote something that made Margaret's breath catch. Anna's letter mentioned her uncle, Weber's brother. The brother had been a soldier too. He was captured by American forces at Normandy in June 1944. He was now in a prisoner of war camp in Texas. He was allowed to send letters home through the Red Cross. And in those letters, he described something Anna could barely believe. He wrote about receiving 2,500 calories of food every day. He wrote about baseball games organized by the Americans. He wrote about a camp cinema where they showed movies twice a week. He wrote about being given cigarettes and chocolate. He wrote that American guards treated them firmly but fairly. He even joked that he was gaining weight in captivity. Margaret looked up at Weber. "Is this real?" she asked. Weber nodded. "My brother does not lie," he said. "He was always honest, even when truth was dangerous." He stirred the potatoes. Steam rose from the pot. The smell made Margaret's stomach clench with desperate hunger. Weber continued talking. "I fought on the Eastern Front," he said. "I saw what we did there. I saw what the SS did. When I was transferred here, I thought I could stay away from the worst of it. But I was wrong." He pulled the pots off the stove. The potatoes were barely cooked, still firm in the middle, but they were hot and edible. Weber grabbed tin plates from a shelf and split the food between the 8 women. Each woman got 1¼ potatoes and a large spoonful of meat and gravy. It was more food than they had seen in one place in 18 months. Margaret picked up her plate with shaking hands. The warmth from the food radiated through the metal. She wanted to devour it immediately. But years of nursing training kicked in. Slowly, she told the other women, "If we eat too fast, we will be sick." They knew she was right. A starving body cannot handle sudden food. It can kill you. They ate in silence. Each small bite felt like a miracle. The potato was plain and unsalted, but it tasted better than anything Margaret remembered from her life before the war. The meat was salty and rich. The fat in the gravy coated her mouth. Her body sang with relief. Beside her, Elise cried quietly as she ate. Tears ran down her hollow cheeks. She did not wipe them away. Her hands were too busy bringing food to her mouth. While they ate, one of the other Wehrmacht guards came to the door. His name was Klaus. He was even older than Weber, maybe 60. He had a limp from the First World War. He carried something in his arms. He set it down on the floor. It was a stack of propaganda leaflets, the kind dropped from Allied planes. Weber picked one up and showed it to Margaret. The leaflet showed a photograph of German prisoners of war in America. They were sitting at tables in a dining hall. The tables had real plates and cups. The men in the photo were smiling. They looked healthy. They had full cheeks and clear eyes. In front of them were trays of food. Margaret could see meat, vegetables, bread, and what looked like cake. "We found these scattered outside the camp fence last week," Klaus said in German. Weber translated for the women. "At first, we thought it was American lies, propaganda to make us surrender. But then I showed it to Friedrich. He compared it to his brother's letters. Everything matched. The food, the treatment, all of it true." Margaret stared at the leaflet. The contrast was so huge it felt impossible. These German soldiers in America were eating better than she had eaten even before the war. They had dessert. They had coffee. They had seconds if they wanted. Meanwhile, here in Germany, Allied prisoners were given 200 grams of sawdust bread and left to starve when supplies ran out. Weber sat down heavily on a wooden crate. He looked exhausted. "I do not understand this war anymore," he said quietly. "My brother is treated like a human being by the enemy. But here, we treat our prisoners like animals. The SS gives orders to let you starve, to march you west into the snow, to shoot anyone too weak to walk. I cannot do that anymore. I will not." He looked at Margaret directly. His eyes were sad and old. "You are someone's daughter too," he said. Klaus spoke up. "There are others like us," he said. "Other Wehrmacht guards who are tired of this. We have been taking food from the commandant's stores for 2 weeks, sneaking it to prisoners when the SS is not watching. Maybe 30 women we have helped, maybe more. It is not much, but it is something." Weber nodded. "When the Soviets come, the SS will try to kill everyone. They want no witnesses, but we will try to stop them, or at least slow them down, give you a chance." Margaret swallowed the last bite of potato. Her mind was reeling. Everything she thought she knew was shifting. The enemy guard was saving her life. The enemy country was treating her fellow soldiers with dignity. The propaganda she had dismissed as lies was actually true. And the real monsters were not the nation she fought against, but the ideology that poisoned it. The SS, the true believers. The ones who saw human beings as numbers to be eliminated. April came with warmer winds and the sound of artillery that never stopped. The Soviet guns were so close now that the ground shook constantly. At night, the eastern horizon glowed orange from burning villages. The SS officers had fled the camp 3 days earlier. They took their files and their personal belongings and drove west in a convoy of trucks. They left behind only destruction. Before they left, they set fire to the administration building to destroy records. They opened the gates to the storage warehouses and told the remaining guards to distribute everything. It was chaos disguised as mercy. Weber did not leave. Neither did Klaus or the handful of other Wehrmacht guards who had been secretly feeding prisoners. They stayed because they knew what would happen if they abandoned the camp. The SS had given final orders before departing. Orders whispered in hallways and written in coded messages. If the Soviets got too close, eliminate the witnesses. 2,000 women were witnesses. 2,000 women knew what had happened in the camps. The SS wanted them silenced, but Weber and his small group refused. They unlocked the barracks. They told the women to hide in the woods if they heard gunfire. They distributed what little food remained, and then they waited. For 3 days they waited. The Soviet artillery crept closer. The sound changed from distant thunder to sharp cracks that made your ears ring. Then, on the morning of April 14th, the shelling stopped. Silence fell over the camp. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy and wrong. Margaret and the other nurses huddled in their barracks. They had not seen Weber for 2 days. Klaus had come by yesterday morning to bring them a bucket of thin soup and some hard biscuits. He said Weber was dealing with SS officers who had returned to check that orders were being followed. Klaus looked scared when he said it. His hands shook as he handed over the bucket. That was the last time anyone saw Klaus alive. The silence lasted for 4 hours. Then Margaret heard engines, not the growl of German vehicles, something different, heavier, the rumble of big American trucks. She crawled to the window and looked out through a crack in the boards. A long column of vehicles rolled into the camp, jeeps with white stars painted on the hoods, trucks carrying soldiers, an ambulance with a red cross on white canvas. These were not Soviets, these were Americans. The camp erupted in noise. Women poured out of the barracks, screaming and crying and waving their arms. Some collapsed immediately, too weak to stand. Others ran toward the American soldiers with the last strength they had. Margaret walked out slowly. Her legs felt like water. She watched as American medics jumped from trucks and started moving through the crowd. They carried medical bags and boxes of supplies. One medic, a young man with red hair and freckles, stopped in front of Margaret. He looked at her face and his expression changed. He had seen wounded soldiers before, but this was different. This was starvation, on a scale he could not comprehend. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can you walk?" Margaret nodded. "To the medical tent," she said. "I'm a nurse." The medic's eyes widened. "You're Allied?" he asked. Margaret almost laughed. "British," she said. "Captured in France, 44. The medic called over his shoulder. "Sarge, we got Allied POWs here, medical personnel." Within minutes, Margaret and the other nurses were surrounded by American soldiers, asking questions, taking notes, offering water and food. The Americans set up a field kitchen in less than an hour. Margaret had never seen anything move so fast. Huge pots appeared. Cases of supplies were unloaded from trucks. Within 90 minutes of arrival, the Americans were serving hot soup to every prisoner in the camp. Real soup, not watery broth. Thick vegetable soup with chunks of beef and carrots and potatoes. Each woman got a full canteen cup. Then they got white bread. Actual white bread, soft and fresh. Then came chocolate bars. Small brown rectangles wrapped in paper. Margaret held hers and stared at it. She had not seen chocolate since before the war. A captain approached her. His name was Wilson. He was from Ohio. He had kind eyes and a notebook in his hand. "Miss Hale," he said. Someone had already told him her name. "We need to document what happened here. Can you tell me about your treatment?" Margaret told him everything. The starvation rations, the forced labor, the women who died from disease and beatings, the SS orders to eliminate prisoners. And then she told him about Weber, about the guard who saved them, about the food he risked his life to steal, about the network of older Wehrmacht soldiers who chose humanity over orders. Wilson wrote it all down. Then he asked the question Margaret was dreading. "Where is this guard now?" "Weber?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "We haven't seen him for 2 days." Wilson nodded slowly. "We'll find out," he said. He walked away to talk to other officers. Margaret sat on the ground and ate her chocolate slowly. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, her body flooded with sugar and energy. Around her, women were crying and eating and hugging each other. Liberation felt like waking up from a nightmare into a dream. 2 hours later, Wilson came back. His face was grim. "We found your guard," he said quietly. Margaret stood up. Her heart knew before he said the words. "He's dead," Wilson continued. "Shot 3 times. In the woods behind the commandant's building." Our translator talked to some of the other guards. "The SS came back 3 days ago. They found out Weber had been hiding food and helping prisoners. They called it defeatism and treason. They executed him on the spot. Klaus too, and one other guard whose name nobody remembers." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. She sat back down hard. Weber had died 3 days before liberation. 3 days. If he had just run away like the other guards, if he had just abandoned them and fled west, he would still be alive. But he stayed. He stayed because he believed it mattered. Because he had daughters and could not bear to let other daughters starve. And it cost him everything. That night, the Americans served a full meal to all the prisoners. Each woman received over 3,000 calories of food. Mashed potatoes with real butter, roasted chicken, green beans, fresh bread with jam, coffee with sugar and cream, and for dessert, canned peaches in syrup. Margaret ate until she felt sick. Her stomach, shrunken from months of starvation, could not handle the richness, but she kept eating anyway. She ate for Weber. She ate for Klaus. She ate for all the women who did not survive to see this day. Later, as the sun set, Margaret saw something that crystallized everything she had learned. A group of German prisoners of war, were brought into camp. They had been captured by the Americans during recent fighting. They were young men, maybe 18 or 19 years old. They looked terrified. American guards told them to sit on the ground near the kitchen, and then the Americans served them food. The same food the liberated prisoners were eating. Chicken and potatoes and bread. The German boys stared at their plates in disbelief. One of them started crying. Margaret watched this scene and understood. The war was not really between nations. It was between two ideas about what human beings were worth. One side saw people as tools to be used and discarded. The other side saw people as worthy of dignity, even when they were enemies. Weber understood that. He chose dignity when his own government chose cruelty, and that choice made him more of an ally than some people who wore the same uniform as Margaret. She wrote in her diary that night by the light of an American lantern. Her handwriting was shaky and weak, but the words were clear. Today I learned that good and evil do not wear flags, they wear choices. Friedrich Weber chose to see daughters instead of prisoners. For that, he gave his life. The Nazis told us Americans were barbaric capitalists who valued money over people, but the barbarians are feeding us with kindness, while my savior lies dead in the woods. I do not know what to believe about nations anymore, but I know what to believe about people. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Margaret heard the news while recovering in an American military hospital in France. She had gained back 15 pounds in 3 weeks. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive. They said another week in that camp would have killed her. She spent her days eating regular meals, sleeping in clean sheets, and writing letters home. Her mother in Manchester received the first letter in June. Her mother collapsed in the kitchen when she read it. Margaret was alive. But before Margaret could go home to England, she had a promise to keep. Captain Wilson had helped her locate Weber's family. They lived in a small town in Bavaria, in the American occupation zone. Weber's wife was named Greta. She had not heard from her husband since March. She did not know if he was alive or dead. The German postal system had collapsed. Communication was impossible. Greta waited every day for news that never came. Margaret was discharged from the hospital in July. She was given travel papers and permission to visit Bavaria before returning to Britain. The journey took 3 days by military transport. She rode in the back of American trucks through destroyed German cities. Frankfurt was rubble. Nuremberg was flattened. Every bridge was blown apart. Every railway station was bombed. Germany looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and dead. Children sat in the ruins begging for food. Old women picked through debris looking for anything useful. This was the country that had started the war. Now it was broken and starving. The truck dropped Margaret off in a village called Rothenburg. It was small and mostly untouched by bombing. The houses were old Bavarian style with painted shutters and flower boxes. But the flowers were dead. Nobody had time to plant new ones. Margaret walked down the main street, carrying a small bag. Inside the bag were 3 things: Weber's letters to his family that she had found in his coat after his death, a written testimony from Captain Wilson about what Weber had done, and a small wooden cross that Klaus had carved and kept in his pocket. Margaret had asked the Americans to recover it from Klaus's body. She thought the families should have something to bury, even if there were no bodies to bring home. She found Greta's house at the end of a narrow lane. It was a 2-story home with a garden in front. The garden was overgrown with weeds. Margaret stood at the gate for a full minute before she found the courage to knock. A woman answered the door. She was thin and tired-looking, maybe 45 years old. Her hair was grey and pulled back in a bun. She wore a faded dress and an apron. She looked at Margaret's British uniform and her face went pale. "Frau Weber?" Margaret asked in halting German. The woman nodded slowly. "I am Margaret Hale," Margaret continued. "I was a prisoner. Your husband saved my life." Greta stared at her. Then her face crumpled and she started to cry. She knew. Somehow she already knew. Margaret had seen that look before on the faces of families receiving death notifications. The body knows before the mind accepts it. Margaret stepped inside. The house was clean but sparse. Most of the furniture had been sold or traded for food. 2 young women sat at a kitchen table. They looked up when Margaret entered. These were Weber's daughters. Anna, the younger one, was 19. Heidi, the older one, was 21. They had their father's eyes, kind and sad. Margaret sat down at the table. She pulled out the letters and the testimony. She told them everything. About the starvation. About Weber finding them barely alive. About the food he stole from the commandant's stores. About the other guards who helped. about his execution 3 days before liberation, about his body found in the woods. Greta sat perfectly still while Margaret talked. Her hands were folded in her lap, tears ran down her face, but she made no sound. Anna sobbed openly. Heidi put her arm around her sister, but her own face was like stone. When Margaret finished, silence filled the kitchen. Outside, a church bell rang the hour. 6 o'clock in the evening. Somewhere in the village, children were playing. Life continued, even when individual lives ended. Finally, Greta spoke. "He wrote to us about you," she said softly. "Not by name, but he wrote in March. He said he had met women who reminded him of his daughters. He said he could not let them suffer. He said if he died trying to help them, it would be a better death than killing them." She looked at Margaret. "Did he suffer?" Margaret shook her head. "The Americans said it was quick," she lied. She had no idea if it was quick, but Greta needed to believe it was quick. Anna wiped her eyes. "Our uncle is still in America," she said. "In Texas. He writes letters. He says the Americans treat him well, better than we treat ourselves here." She gestured at the bare kitchen. "We have no food. The rations are smaller than during the war. Everything is destroyed. But Uncle Friedrich eats 3 meals a day in his camp. He has a bed, and medicine, and books." She looked at Margaret with confusion in her eyes. "Why did your people treat our soldiers so well, while our people starved yours?" Margaret had thought about this question every day since liberation. She had an answer now. "Because one side believed in rules," she said, "and one side believed in power. The Geneva Convention says prisoners must be treated with dignity. America followed those rules even when Germany did not. Your father understood that. He chose to follow the rules of humanity instead of the orders of the SS. That is why he saved us. And that is why he died." Heidi spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet and firm. "What will you do with his story?" she asked. Margaret had been thinking about that too. "I will testify," she said, "at the tribunals. There will be trials for war criminals. I will tell them that not all Germans were monsters, that men like your father and Klaus chose differently, that they should be remembered." Greta nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret stayed in Rothenburg for 3 days. She helped the family prepare a memorial service, even though there was no body to bury. The village priest held a small ceremony in the church. 12 people came. They were other families who had lost sons and fathers and husbands. They sang hymns in German. Margaret did not know the words, but she hummed along. After the service, Greta gave Margaret a photograph. It showed Weber in his Wehrmacht uniform before the war. He was smiling. He looked younger and happier. "Keep this," Greta said. "Remember him as he was, not as the war made him." Margaret returned to England in August 1945. She arrived in Manchester on a rainy afternoon. Her mother met her at the train station, and they held each other and cried for 20 minutes on the platform. Margaret moved back into her childhood home. She tried to return to nursing, but found she could not handle the hospital environment. The smells and sounds triggered memories of the camp. She left nursing and became a teacher instead. She taught history at a girls' school. Every year, on April 14th, the anniversary of liberation, Margaret wrote a letter to Greta Weber. She wrote about her life in England, about the students she taught, about the world slowly healing from war. Greta wrote back. She told Margaret about Anna's wedding, about Heidi becoming a nurse, about rebuilding their lives in occupied Germany. The letters continued for 30 years. In 1975, Anna came to England to visit Margaret. She brought her own daughter, named Margaret in honor of the nurse her grandfather saved. The 2 women walked through Manchester together. Anna's daughter was 16 and full of questions about the war. Margaret took them to a museum that had an exhibit about prisoner of war camps. There was a display showing the difference in treatment between Allied and Axis camps. Photos showed German prisoners in America playing soccer and attending classes. Other photos showed Allied prisoners in German camps, skeletal and dying. Anna's daughter asked the obvious question, why were they so different? Margaret looked at the young girl and repeated what she had told Greta 30 years earlier. Because one side believed people had value no matter what uniform they wore, and one side believed value came from ideology. Your great-grandfather chose to believe in value. He paid for that belief with his life. Margaret died in 1989 at the age of 68. In her will, she left a letter to be published. The letter told Weber's full story. It was printed in newspapers across Britain and Germany. The headline read, "The Enemy Who Saved Us." The article described everything: the starvation, the hidden food, The execution, the choice between orders and humanity. Hundreds of people wrote letters in response. Many were other former prisoners who remembered similar acts of kindness from individual German soldiers. Others were Germans who remembered family members who had resisted in small ways and paid terrible prices. Weber's story became part of the historical record. Not a big part, not a famous part, but a true part. His name appears in books about righteous Gentiles and moral courage during the Holocaust. His choice is studied in ethics classes. His letters are kept in a museum in Bavaria. And his photograph, the one Greta gave to Margaret, hangs in the Imperial War Museum in London with a small plaque underneath. The plaque reads, Friedrich Weber, Wehrmacht Guard. Executed April 1945 for feeding starving prisoners. The war was not between nations, but between choices. This man chose correctly,